Hello, everybody. Welcome to our last AP exam review video here that I will be doing. This one is going to cover periods 8 and 9, which covers basically from the Cold War to the present. Now, these periods, generally, if you do see questions from these, they usually involve the civil rights movement or something having to do with the Cold War, at least from a DBQ or an FRQ perspective. But generally, those are the areas that you see questions from. Actually, when I took the AP exam in high school, either my DBQ or FRQ was actually from period 8 and had to do, or actually from period 9, and had to do with President Reagan. So let's go ahead and jump on in. Period 8, again, this is the last of our periods that is worth 10 to 17%, or it makes up 10 to 17% of the curriculum on the AP exam. So again, as you've seen, basically from period 1 and period 2, and then on after those, everything is 10 to 17% of the curriculum covered on the exam. Now, why were the dates chosen 1945 to 1980? Well, 1945 is obviously the end of World War II. It is going to be the beginning of the Cold War. 1980 marks the election of future President Ronald Reagan. He will be elected, and which starts the conservative movement, which will again have an impact for the next 30 plus years after he is elected. Some essay topics that you might see on this one is foreign policy, and again, this is going to be related to the Cold War. They might compare it across time periods, but again, with the Cold War, they tend to really focus on foreign policy when they are discussing that in questions. Also, civil rights, they might compare and contrast that with other periods, maybe after the Civil War, what civil rights look like, then compared to after the Civil Rights Movement. Now, what is all is covered in this time period? I've already mentioned the Cold War. With the Cold War, you're going to see a lot of events covered with that. Obviously, you're going to have two big wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. You're also going to have during this period the Civil Rights Movement. And with the Civil Rights Movement, kind of born out of that is going to be the women's rights movement and the gay rights movement as well. You're also going to see in the 1970s LBJ and the Great Society, and actually in the 1960s, you're going to see LBJ and the Great Society and kind of the political fallout from the Great Society. Also during this time, you're going to see political scandals and controversies. Of course, the most famous scandal being the Watergate scandal, where we have our first ever president resign from office. And then in the Middle East, things really ratchet up in the Middle East as we get into the 1990s and then early 21st century. So let's go ahead and get into period 8. So what is going to be the U.S. policy after World War II? Well, George Kennan, who is an advisor to President Harry Truman, he comes up with the idea of containment. And the idea of containment, the simple idea behind that is the containment of communism, and that should be a big part of U.S. foreign policy. And that would be a huge part of U.S. foreign policy from 1945 until the early 1990s would be our goal, to contain communism, basically slow down the spread and the influence of the Soviet Union. You also hear this referred to as the Truman Doctrine. A lot of times people use those two terms interchangeably when talking about containment. Containment was part of the Truman Doctrine, and just the Truman Doctrine is more of the way that Truman played that out as president and some of the things that he did. Now, in the wake of World War II, you would see the development of the United Nations. The United Nations, again, are going to be a whole lot different in the League of Nations in that one, first of all, the United States is going to join, but the general setup of the United Nations is going to be a lot different. What is the goal of the UN? Collective security, economic frameworks. The UN, there's going to be a lot of parts to the UN, the World Health Organization, and the UN is going to kind of become this global organization that nations are part of that has a lot of different tools. Another big thing that you're going to see that develops as a result of the Cold War is going to be NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And that is going to be the organization where basically the United States and Western European countries unite together to kind of to have collective security against what was happening with the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. Now, the Soviet Union would respond by creating their own collective security organization known as the Warsaw Pact. Also, after World War II, again, part of this idea of containment of communism, and then the Truman Doctrine is going to be this idea of we have to help countries in Western Europe and help prevent them from falling to communism. And again, this is going to expand and not just be Western Europe, but also going to be all around the world. So out of that comes the Marshall Plan, which again, the Marshall Plan gave money to countries in Europe, basically to help them get back on track, to help their economies get back on track, but also as a way to help prevent those nations from falling to communism. And then the Truman Doctrine is going to be a big part of that. Of course, Greece and Turkey are going to be the first two countries that really benefit from the Truman Doctrine as we inject money into those areas, again, to help them from falling to communism. So again, the U.S., as part of the containment policy, we made it a goal to support non-communist governments, even if they weren't the most democratic that we had seen. Again, the goal was to keep them from falling to communism. So some examples would be in Iran, you'd have Secretary Batista in Cuba, and then in South Vietnam as well. Now, the first real war that is fought, again, you're going to see a lot of tension during JFK's presidency. You'll see a lot of tension with Cuba, but preceding that, you are going to have the Korean War, which is our first real war for containment. And again, the whole goal of that is a Soviet and Chinese-supported North Korean government decides to try to take over South Korea. We step in. Again, this was a United Nations action, not specifically a U.S. action, but a United Nations action, which steps in, which prevents South Korea from falling to communism. And again, even preceding the Korean War, you're going to see that China falls to communism, which is, again, another one of those things that is going to stoke fear in the West that countries are very vulnerable to falling to communism. And that is why we're going to get involved in first Korea, then Cuba. We would play parts in Cuba as well. And then, of course, the Vietnam War. Now, you're going to see throughout the whole Cold War that tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union kind of fluctuate. Sometimes they're kind of good, and then other times they are very, very bad. And that's why I put on here they fluctuated between confrontation and détente, which détente is basically a relaxation of tensions that you're going to see, like Nixon tries détente to try to reduce some of those tensions. Now, I already mentioned Cuba. Obviously, the Korean War is fought when Truman is in office. JFK comes into, or Eisenhower comes into office, and then JFK comes into office. And Cuba is going to be the big headache for JFK when he is president, because in Cuba, you're going to have the fall of the government there that we supported under Batista, and have Fidel Castro come to power. And Fidel Castro is going to create a very, very close relationship with the Soviet Union, which is going to lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis once we find out the Soviets have put missiles in Cuba. You'd also have the SALT treaties. Again, that's an example of a reduction of tensions between the two countries. Again, agreeing to reduce some of the arms and weapons that we have to hopefully avoid war between the two countries. Now, what did the home front look like during the Cold War? You're going to see there are debates over liberty versus order. Again, there is a lot of fear of communism during this time. And so when you have that much fear, you tend to see a reduction in civil rights or rights and liberties just in general. So there's going to be that question of how do we balance those two things to make sure that there is security and order, but also having liberty at the same time. Probably the most famous example of where this goes really off the rails is going to be with the Second Red Scare, which was designed to help root out communists, specifically communists that were in the government. You'd have the House of Representatives create the HUAC, which is the House Un-American Activities Committee. And again, coming out of that, you were going to see Joseph McCarthy, who is pictured there at the bottom. Of course, McCarthy starts branding people communists, claiming that he has this list of communists that are working in the U.S. government. Again, another thing that gets really, really scared. And basically, everybody comes out to find out in the end that Joseph McCarthy was basically a sham. But again, the damage had already been done enough to scare people during that time. Now, With that, you are going to see Eisenhower. Again, we said Eisenhower comes after Truman as president, and Eisenhower is going to issue a big warning in his farewell address. And the thing that he is going to warn, which is interesting, him as a former military general is going to warn this. He warned of a large military in peacetime and what he called the military-industrial complex. And he warned of the dangers of that and that it could be very, very dangerous for people's liberties if we had that large standing army and if the military-industrial complex, as he called it, would be like the defense industries and that kind of thing, had too much power, what that could mean for the people. Now, demographically during this time, you're going to see the growth of the Sun Belt, which is basically the southern part of the U.S. going from Florida over to Southern California. And you're going to see that these areas gain an increase in population and as well as the emergence of new industries. The reason this is going to be so important is because politically, the Sun Belt is going to become a very, very important area because, again, as more and more people move to those areas, they get more representation in Congress, and basically politicians have to pay attention to those areas. Now, one thing I failed to mention with this is also in the wake of World War II, you're going to have the baby boom that happens. All of the people coming back from World War II having babies, and you're going to have this massive population growth during this time, which with it is going to bring a lot of things. You're going to have suburbia kind of get started, people moving out of the cities really in large scales to live in the suburbs, and a lot of other things with that as well. Now, Vietnam, of course, Vietnam kind of gets cranked up a little bit under Eisenhower and then JFK, but it really explodes when LBJ comes into office. And you're going to see that as the Vietnam War drags on and on and on, that it becomes more and more unpopular here in the U.S. It kind of leads to the protest movement as well as the counterculture movement as well here in the United States. Now, why were we in Vietnam to start with? Again, the same as Korea. North Vietnam had invaded South Vietnam, and so we come in to protect South Vietnam and to hopefully prevent it from falling to communism, which we would fail in eventually with that. So the interesting thing with Vietnam is that because it was not fought in a traditional way, again, most of it was guerrilla warfare, it was hard to measure what success looked like during that. And then 1968, you're going to see eventually the Tet Offensive happen. And that's what really opened a lot of people's eyes to realize, hey, the Vietnam War is not going as the government is telling us it is going. The Tet Offensive was a North Vietnamese offensive where they struck a lot of locations, military bases throughout all of Vietnam, a very coordinated attack. And yes, it would be unsuccessful, but it would be successful in bringing to the attention of a lot of Americans, hey, Vietnam is not going the way that we thought it actually was. Again, that feeds more protests, most famously leading to the Kent State Massacre in Ohio, where you have several college students who are killed by National Guard members in a protest while there. All right, talking about civil rights during this time and during this era, you're going to see that in order for African Americans to get more and more civil rights, that the government is going to play an important role in this as well as the protest movement. So all three branches would play an important role. Harry Truman, when he was president, as part of the executive branch, of course, he would oversee the desegregation of the military. Again, the Korean War would be the first war that we would fight, where the military would be officially desegregated. A judicial, you're going to have the Brown versus Board decision, which reverses the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Remember, Plessy versus Ferguson said separate but equal is okay and is constitutional. The Brown versus Board decision overturns that. Again, the Brown versus Board decision was not only the Brown versus Board case, but also was 5 cases dealing with segregation of schools. One of those cases even coming from here in Virginia in Prince Edward County in Davis versus Prince Edward County. You'd also eventually have legislation that would come out. LBJ would sign 2 pieces of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act of 64 is what officially ends segregation, and the Voting Rights Act is what is going to be done to get rid of poll taxes, literacy tests, and that kind of things that had been in place. So what was reaction like to desegregation? You're going to see what is known known as massive resistance come out of the South, where states basically say, including Virginia here, that's going to say, yeah, we're not going to follow along with any of what if the federal government is saying that we have to do. They would issue the Southern Manifesto, basically stating the same thing of, we are going to fight this. We see this as unconstitutional, what the government is trying to do. Of course, most famously, you would see here in Virginia, again, Prince Edward County, where one of the Brown versus Board cases had come out of. They would be the ones to really take massive resistance to the extreme by actually closing down public schools for 5 years to prevent desegregation of the schools there. Also, another famous example you're going to see is in Little Rock High School, where you are actually going to have federal troops come in and escort African Americans into the school there, forcing them to desegregate. So you're going to see that with this, the federal government really does extend a heavy hand in ensuring that the South does what they need to do or what they have been told to do as far as desegregating the schools. Now, activists used many, many methods to fight segregation. Of course, legal challenges. For example, the Brown versus Board, where that was 5 different cases being brought before the court, direct action and nonviolent protests. Of course, the nonviolent protests led by Martin Luther King Jr. And again, that is going to serve as one of the big things that gets public opinion swayed in the favor of African American civil rights and using the government to do that, because people see these images on TV from the Deep South of Bull Connor and his dogs and fire hoses attacking African American protesters who are being nonviolent, and that really changes people's perspective. You'd also have the March on Washington during this time, again, which brings more exposure to the idea that African Americans needed to have their rights guaranteed just as everyone else did. Now, you're going to see post-1965 that tensions over philosophies would increase. Again, we already talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and his idea of peaceful, nonviolent protests. And then on the other end of that spectrum, you're going to have Malcolm X, who believed by any means necessary, including if violence needed to be used, that it should be used to ensure African Americans' rights. And it's kind of similar to the disagreement that we talked about earlier in this class between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who had very different views on how to go about achieving equal rights for African Americans. That brings us, again, continuing with LBJ. LBJ had what he called the Great Society programs. And basically what the Great Society programs are going to be is a New Deal type program. But in this instance, again, it's not to pull the country out of a Great Depression, but again, it's to try to pull people out of poverty. The Great Society was also known as the War on Poverty. So you would see a continuation of New Deal type programs, new government programs put in place, such as Medicare and Medicaid, as well as with the Great Society programs, you're going to have those civil rights bills that I've already talked about that get passed. And this is seen as kind of the height of liberalism, increasing involvement of the federal government and the power of the government to step in and try to fix some of the problems in society that people saw. Now, after this, we're going to talk about the conservative movement, which is very much a reaction to the liberal movement of the Great Society in the War on Poverty. In 1965, you would have the Immigration Act, which once signed, this eliminated that quota system that had been set up in the 1920s and actually encouraged people from Asia and Latin America to immigrate to the U.S. Along with this time, you're also going to see the growth in civil rights, like I said, kind of coming out of the African American civil rights movement. You would have the women movement with Betty Friedan, and now Betty Friedan, who writes The Feminine Mystique, which again writes in it about society and kind of challenging some of those traditional gender roles that you had seen. And again, a lot of those gender roles, which you had seen on TV during the 1950s and the 1960s with the TV that shows. And she starts again now, which is the National Organization of Women, which was made to help advocate for rights for women. As far as LGBTQ, you were going to see the Stonewall riots that happened in New York City. And really that is seen historically as the beginning of the gay rights movement in the country. And again, that's going to bring a lot of publicity to that. And again, you're going to see the growth of that movement afterwards. Also, you're going to see the Latino movement with Cesar Chavez, who starts this. Again, he was a union leader in the West who tries to bring not only more attention to the ideas and principles of the Union, but also to the idea that Latino rights should be protected in the nation as well. Now, Supreme Court decisions, you are going to see those really do expand freedom during this time. And a few examples of some important cases, and again, there are a lot of them, but these are ones that are frequently mentioned or referenced on the AP exam. Griswold versus Connecticut. This was a Supreme Court decision that struck down laws prohibiting birth control and established a right to privacy for women in regards to like birth control and what is happening with your doctor. Also during this time, outside of women's rights, you're going to see defendants' rights in Miranda versus Arizona. I'm sure you've heard of before being read your Miranda rights. That is going to come out of this Miranda versus Arizona case, which basically says that when you are arrested, that you have to be made aware of your constitutional rights. And you can see them listed there on the screen. You have the right to remain silent. Anything that you say and do could be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to attorney, blah, blah, blah. All right, so what were the impact of the Great Society and some of these Supreme Court decisions? You're going to see that helps motivate the conservative movement. Again, during this time, you're going to have the Warren Court, which is historically known as a very, very liberal court. And again, the decisions that they make is going to be one of those things that is going to influence the conservative movement. Now, another thing that's going to grow during this time is environmental concerns. Again, all the industrialization that had been happening after World War II and even before that, people started to look more at the environment. And I have seen, I think within the past 5 years, actual questions, multiple choice questions, but also some writing questions, short answer questions about the environmental concerns and what the influence of them would be. Now, all of this kind of gets kicked off with Rachel Carson, who is pictured there, who writes Silent Spring, and she brought basically awareness in writing Silent Spring about the dangers of pesticides on the environment. And the federal government is going to respond to this. Again, a lot of people read this book and say, hey, we need to do something more to help protect the environment. And you're going to see the creation under Richard Nixon of the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as later you would have the Clean Air Act signed as well. So that's the green movement. Not only with that, you're also going to have a consumer protection movement happen as well. Most famously, and again, they like to throw him on the exam every once in a while, Ralph Nader, who wrote Unsafe at Any Speed, who wrote about the danger of the car, the Chevrolet Corvair. And because of his book, that is going to lead to mandated seatbelts in cars and some other things for companies, basically to put in some consumer protections. Now, with the 1960s, you're going to see the counterculture of the 60s emerge. And basically that baby boom generation that you had, the World War II generation, you're going to see they come back and they want normalcy. And there is going to be a lot of conformity kind of in their culture. And again, if you want to best see that, watch a 1950s TV show that represents a typical family during that. The counterculture of the 60s is going to kind of be the striking back, the opposite of what the conformity culture had looked like in the 1950s. You're going to see the counterculture starts to challenge many of the ideas of their parents' generations, economically, socially, and politically, and is going to help initiate a sexual revolution. Again, you're going to see that best shown in the Woodstock music festival that is going to happen. That's kind of considered like the mecca of the counterculture movement in the 1960s. So that brings us to period 9. Again, period 9, a much, much shorter one. I would tend to think that you will see period 9, unless it's involving Ronald Reagan and the conservative movement. More of your questions with period 9 is going to be on the multiple choice portion of that. And again, they tend to not a lot of times come into more of the modern presidents. I don't think I would expect to see anything about Donald Trump on there. And generally when they do, it's a quote and it's usually relating it to something else in history. So period 9, again, covers 1980 to the present. 1980, obviously, again, being the election of Ronald Reagan and the start of the conservative movement. Again, you typically don't see essays focused exclusively on this period. Now, again, that doesn't mean it can't happen. Several years ago, they did have an essay on the conservative movement. I'm pretty sure it was a DBQ that they had on the conservative movement. So this period, You're going to see it covers the end of the Cold War, Ronald Reagan, the conservative movement, and then terrorism with the 9/11 attacks. So what is going to invigorate conservative and really get the conservative movement going during this time? One, economic problems. And again, people tend to challenge the government more when there is a period of a very, very bad economy. And that's what happened in the 1970s. You had a period of massive inflation. Jimmy Carter gets elected as a Democrat in 1976. And again, he doesn't do a lot to help out that inflation. You'd also have the gas crisis and a lot of other things happen during this time. And again, the economy wasn't doing well, so people immediately start to blame the liberal policies that are in place and look for something different. You'd also see during this time the growth of religious fundamentalism. Again, not much as more people getting in church, but you're going to see the church, which had typically stayed out of politics, is going to start getting involved in politics. And you probably heard the term evangelicals today. This is where you're going to see the start of the evangelical movement, started by Jerry Falwell Sr., who starts Moral Majority and really encourages evangelical Christians to vote in elections. Again, because of the poor economy, you're going to see a lot of people lost faith completely in the government's ability to be able to solve problems. Also, under Jimmy Carter, you're going to see a lot of foreign policy failures, or what people perceived as foreign policy failures. For one, the big issue that Jimmy Carter just could not figure out was the Iran hostage crisis. Again, Iran there, the government that we supported, had been overthrown. You have American hostages there from 1979 to basically when Reagan gets elected. And again, people perceived Jimmy Carter as very, very weak because he couldn't get these hostages freed. And then, of course, Reagan gets elected and the hostages are almost immediately freed. Again, a lot of that due to some of the back work that Jimmy Carter had done, and some of that too, just Iran trying to show up Jimmy Carter, who they didn't really like. So what were some conservative victories that you're going to have during this time? One, taxation, a reduction in taxes and what is known as Reaganomics. Again, Reagan believed in supply side theory. You put more money back into people's hands, they will spend that money, and then that will invigorate the economy. That's why it gets known as kind of trickle down economics. Again, people spend the money and then it goes into the economy. You would also see the deregulation of many industries during this time. Again, less government getting involved, and it is seen as deregulation of industries would be good. It would help companies to spend less money, but also have those companies, by spending less money, they could have cheaper products and do a lot of things to help out the economies. You're going to see that as far as moral deals that evangelicals really pushed and wanted guys like Ronald Reagan to do more about. The big one being abortion. Abortion would still remain legal. Now, probably the biggest of the conservative victories is going to be that they denounce big government and they favor small government. But unfortunately with that, again, so this isn't really much a victory. You could say the size of the federal government would grow. And again, even though the government or the federal government is going to try to do a lot, and Reagan is going to try to do a lot to reduce the size of government and reduce the influence of government, you're going to see that the size of the government actually grows during this time. Again, it would be very, very hard for conservatives to eliminate very, very popular programs such as Medicare and Social Security. So when you're kind of evaluating the conservative movement as a whole, you're going to see it's kind of a mixed bag, but really the conservative movement is going to have a big, big impact even outside of Reagan in kind of changing where Democrats have to run instead of having to running far left with their policies. When we get to Bill Clinton, you're going to see that he comes more to the center with some of his policies. So, foreign policy under Reagan, and I think probably this is Reagan's greatest policy, he would reject the whole idea of détente and take what he called, or what was known as, a hard line on communism. He pointed out the Soviet Union and said, look, this is an evil empire. Even though he called them an evil empire, he did work with them and had positive relationships with Mikhail Gorbachev, such as in getting arms reductions and that sort of thing. But Reagan, again, was very vocal in standing up to the Soviet Union. And again, that is most well known and well showed when he is there standing outside the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and says, Secretary Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And he does put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. Again, you're going to see that under Reagan, the U.S. really ups the military spending. Again, another one of those things that's going to put pressure on the Soviet Union. So how was the economy post-1980? You're going to see that the U.S. would see a decrease in manufacturing and union jobs due to outsourcing. Again, companies started to realize they could make things cheaper outside of the country. Despite that, though, that in the 80s and 90s, you're going to see that the economy is doing very, very well. Outside of the early 90s, where you're going to have some period of recession, outside of that, the economy was doing really, really well. Now, there would be debates over free trade agreements such as NAFTA. NAFTA will be signed under President Clinton, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which basically set up free trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. But there would be a lot of debates over that. And again, sitting here in 2021 as we are, we know Donald Trump, one of the things that he ran on was getting rid of these free trade agreements because he felt like that it was bad for the U.S. economy. Also, the size of government safety nets. You'll see there's a lot of discussion on Social Security reform, how to reform that program as whole. Also, welfare reform is going to be a big topic of discussion, especially during the presidency of Bill Clinton. All right. U.S. population shifts, we've already mentioned the Sun Belt growing, and that would continue to happen during this period. This would lead to a lot of policy debates. Again, we were encouraging more immigrants to come in from Latin America and Asia. Asia is not going to really be the issue as far as immigration goes. Latin America, and specifically dealing with illegal immigration, is going to be the big policy kind of headache and debate for everybody. Obviously, it's 2021, and we still have not figured out a solution to that. So, yeah, that hasn't been solved since. Changes for homosexuals during this time. You're going to see that before this, homosexuals were not allowed to serve in the military. Under Clinton, that policy is going to change to the don't ask, don't tell policy, which, again, didn't let anyone openly gay serve in the military, but would allow them to serve as long as they didn't bring it up at all. This would later be underturned under President Obama in 2011. Now, that brings us to, again, you're going to have Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and during that time, we are going to fight the Desert Storm, which is our first war in Iraq, and win that pretty easily. Next up, you're going to have Bill Clinton and then George W. Bush. The same year that George Bush is sworn in as president, you're going to have the 9/11 attacks, where terrorists would fly 4 planes, 3 of them hitting buildings and 1 of them crashing in Pennsylvania. Now, the response to the 9/11 attacks is going to be, of course, the war in Afghanistan to help root out not only the Taliban, which is the leading party there, but also Osama bin Laden, who had been responsible and was the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. Also, though, you are going to have the Patriot Act be passed here in the U.S., which would give the government agencies basically more power to try to root out terrorism in the country, because you're going to see in the wake of 9/11, one of the things that comes out is that a lot of these government agencies had information but did not work together with that. So that's why you're going to see, as a result of the 9/11 attacks, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, with the war on terrorism, you're going to see the war in Iraq. Again, we enter that because we believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and were contributing to these terrorist attacks that were happening throughout the world. And that is why we would get involved in Iraq for the second time. Now, this war, quickly we would be able to overthrow Saddam Hussein's government there. Saddam Hussein would be captured and would later be executed by the Iraqi people after he went through a trial. He was executed for massive war crimes that he had committed over a long, long time. Now, what was the impact of the war on terrorism? Again, debates over civil liberties versus government power. And again, that's one of these things that you're going to see throughout history, starting with the Alien Sedition Acts during John Adams' presidency. World War I, we talked about the Espionage Act, there we go. The Espionage Act during World War I, and then the Patriot Act is going to be part of that as well. So just remember that, again, the AP, they love to compare against periods. If they bring these up in a multiple choice question, you can guarantee 100% that they will be comparing between periods with these. With this, I want to say good luck on the exam. We are still going to cover a few more things here with some people and as well as court cases. Again, this is famously, I can't remember if I ever told you about this when we taught this in class. That is LBJ doing what was known as the LBJ lean. He kind of did this as a way to intimidate people. He would get very close to them in their face and kind of lean over them because he was a very, very tall guy. So let's jump in really quickly to some people that you need to know. Again, some of these people we have already mentioned, so we'll go through them pretty quickly. One of them is going to be George Kennan. He is the father of the whole containment policy that we talked about. George Marshall, who had been a general, and he would be the Secretary of State. He would come up with the whole Marshall Plan. Eisenhower, again, general during World War II, and would come up with in his farewell address where he warns of the military-industrial complex. The Shah of Iran, again, this is going to be important. He would be the leader of the CIA, leader after the CIA had overthrown the leader that was already in place in Iran. Now, Iran would have a government that was very, very friendly to Western governments. And then later you're going to see in the 70s that government would be overthrown by people that were much more fundamentalist and much more restrictive than the Western government had been. Ho Chi Minh, he is going to be, again, he's going to try to unify Vietnam as a communist nation, and that is going to be primarily who we are fighting against in the Vietnam War. Next up, with civil rights, some important people to know. Rosa Parks with the Montgomery bus boycott, again, getting on that bus, refusing to give up her seat, and she kind of becomes a symbol of the civil rights movement as a result of that. Martin Luther King Jr., we have talked about him, but again, he's going to be very, very influential in the bus boycott that is going to happen and in the March on Washington. Emmett Till, we mentioned him when we talked about him in class. He is a black teenager who would be brutally murdered in the South for allegedly whistling at a white woman. Why is Emmett Till so important to U.S. history? Well, his mom actually arranges for his body to be on display in Chicago during his funeral. Pictures run nationwide of what his body looked like. And again, this is going to be one of those things that really wakes people up to the cruelty of lynching and how things were for African Americans in certain parts of the country. The Little Rock Nine, we mentioned Little Rock High School. Those are going to be the 9 black students that are escorted in by the military to the high school there after it is segregated. I mentioned Malcolm X previously, but he is going to advocate black nationalism and again have a little bit of a different attitude towards how to achieve equality compared to Martin Luther King Jr. Again, both MLK and Malcolm X would be assassinated. Authors to know, Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. We already talked about her, and Rachel Carson with Silent Spring. Some miscellaneous people that you need to know is Phyllis Schlafly. She is going to be the leading woman. She's pictured right there at the bottom against the Stop the Equal Rights Amendment. Again, but kind of before she emerges on the scene, you're going to see that it looked like the Equal Rights Amendment would easily pass and be added to the U.S. Constitution. She sought to stop it, bringing up a lot of arguments about how women would be eligible for the draft then and that kind of thing. And she is really credited with one of the big people that helped stop the ERA from getting passed. The Beat generation, 1950s, again, we talked about like the lost generation of writers in the 20s. The Beat generation is going to be another one of those generations of writers that is going to be critical of consumerism. LBJ, we mentioned him with the Great Society. We did not mention as much LBJ with escalating the Vietnam War, but you're going to see that makes LBJ an incredibly unpopular president because of him increasing the troop levels in Vietnam. And again, we already talked about how immigration changed. Now, period 9 key people, again, Ronald Reagan. And as I have already said, if you see a DBQ question about period 9, it is definitely going to focus on Reagan and the conservative movement and something having to do with that. Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, the leader of the Soviet Union, who kind of sees the way for the Soviet Union to eventually collapse. But he puts in a lot of democratic changes, such as glasnost glasnost and perestroika, which were both democratic changes to how things were done there. And he basically oversees the fall of the Soviet Union and then the building up of those new states that now weren't any longer part of that. Osama bin Laden, again, he'd be very, very key. He was the leader of Al-Qaeda and orchestrates the attacks on September 11th, 2001. Those attacks, again, not only had he played part in that, he had also played part in the 1993 World Trade Center attacks, as well as other terrorist attacks around the world during this time. This would lead to the war in Afghanistan. We wouldn't have any luck finding him in Afghanistan. Apparently, he went over and hid in Pakistan. Finally, under President Barack Obama, the military would find him and he would be killed. Saddam Hussein, we mentioned him as the leader of Iraq, and sorry about the break there. We had an announcement. Saddam Hussein, we mentioned him. He was the leader of Iraq. He's the one suspected of having weapons of mass destruction, and he is the one that would eventually be caught by U.S. forces and be turned over to his own people to go on trial and would be executed. So that's the key people with Unit 9. And then lastly, we're going to look at a couple court cases here. We mentioned Brown versus Board being the key Supreme Court case. This is one that is specifically mentioned in the AP curriculum. But Brown versus Board, what did Brown versus Board do? It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and declared school segregation unconstitutional. How did the court support this? They used the 14th Amendment, which again guarantees equal rights to African Americans. What is the impact of this? Again, milestone in the Civil Rights Act, and also is going to lead to Southern resistance to integrating the schools. Also during this time, during the Great Society programs, some Supreme cases that you'll hear talked about. Miranda versus Arizona, we've already talked about that. That supports the idea of increased civil rights by letting people know that when they are arrested that they have certain rights. Escobedo versus Illinois, that gives you the right to an attorney at a time of arrest. And then Tinker versus Des Moines, which was a free speech case that said students could wear black armbands as a sign of protest. Now, that's it. With content with this. Again, I encourage you, do your best on this AP exam. It might seem super overwhelming because it is a whole lot of information, but just remember you have gone through this whole class. You have been exposed to everything. So hopefully nothing on the AP exam really shocks you or surprises you, or there's not anything on there that you're like, man, I've never heard of that before. If there does happen to be something on there that you are unsure about, my suggestion is use context clues. Think about, maybe they give you a date. Think about what's going on in the country at that time. And a lot of times that can help you kind of like steer you in the right direction or help you to make an educated guess on something that you are not sure about. So again, I've enjoyed having you as part of this class. Best of luck on the AP exam. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and I would be more than willing to help you out however I can. Again, good luck and have a great day.